You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The sealed envelope arrived on a Saturday night at precisely 11:47 p.m, sliding beneath my door with the whisper of parchment against ancient stone. But it wasn't the sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was the silence that followed, a silence so complete that even my own heartbeat seemed to cease in deference to whatever had delivered it. In 30 years of service to the Vatican's most classified department, I had learned to recognize omens by their weight alone. This envelope bore the papal seal pressed in crimson wax that never seemed to fully dry, leaving fingerprints that burned like frostbite, and whispered names in languages that had been extinct since before the pyramids were dreams in the minds of pharaohs. The parchment felt wrong between my fingers, not cold exactly, but absent of warmth in a way that suggested it had been touched by hands that had never known life. The script inside seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at it, and reading it left me with the distinct impression that something was reading me in return. Vilhelm Abbey, Loire Valley, France, do not delay, no soul is safe. Below the message, in ink that gleamed like fresh blood, was a single additional line that made my hands shake. This is the last one, Corvin. I am Father Corvin Elbrecht, and I am the Vatican's final solution to problems that have no names. When cardinals speak my name, they cross themselves twice and burn the words they've spoken. When the Pope mentions my work, he does so only in the sealed chambers, 3 levels beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where the walls are lined with lead and blessed salt, and no recording device can function for more than 30 seconds before its components begin to melt. The official records state that I died in a monastery fire, or in Bavaria, in 1994, and my gravestone in Rome bears flowers that never wilt, and a headstone that casts no shadow even at noon. The unofficial truth is far more complex and infinitely more damning. I exist in the spaces between Vatican doctrine and Vatican necessity, in the gaps where official policy meets cosmic horror and finds itself inadequate. When possession cases escalate beyond the power of trained exorcists, when blessed crosses burst into flames at the sight of the afflicted, when holy water turns to steam before it can touch corrupted flesh, when the very foundations of reality begin to buckle under the weight of infernal presence, they send me. But not to banish evil, though that's what the surviving witnesses always report. No, my true purpose is far darker and infinitely more necessary. I am a living reliquary, a consecrated prison designed to contain forces that are too dangerous to destroy and too ancient to ignore. The carriage that came for me at dawn was pulled by horses whose eyes reflected starlight even in broad daylight, driven by a man whose employment records in the Vatican archives dated back 4 centuries, but whose face had never aged a single day. We travelled for 2 days through French countryside that should have been magnificent in late spring, but reality grew increasingly thin as we approached our destination. At first, the wrongness was subtle enough that an ordinary traveller might have attributed it to fatigue or imagination. Flowers bloomed in shades that had no names in any human language, their petals catching light in ways that suggested they absorbed more than they reflected. Trees stood leafless despite the season, their branches forming angles that created shadows even under the overcast sky, shadows that moved independently of the wind, and sometimes formed shapes that resembled reaching hands. By the second day, the wrongness had become undeniable. We passed through 3 villages where every door was painted red, with pigment that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and salt lines crossed every threshold in patterns that hurt to look at for more than a few seconds. Children watched us from windows with eyes that held knowledge no child should possess, and when they waved, their shadows waved back several seconds later, as though struggling to keep up with movements that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. In the town of Amboise, the local priest ran alongside our carriage for nearly a mile, shouting prayers in Latin that predated the church by centuries, until his voice gave out and he collapsed on the cobblestones. When I looked back, I saw him making the sign of the cross backward, over and over, as though trying to undo something he had inadvertently blessed. The driver never spoke during our journey, never ate, never showed any signs of fatigue. When I dozed fitfully in the carriage's leather interior, I dreamed of roads that led to places that didn't exist on any earthly map, and I woke with the taste of sulphur and something far worse coating my tongue like ash. Vilhelm Abbey first appeared as a silhouette against storm clouds that moved against the wind, perched on a cliff face like a great stone predator, surveying territory that extended beyond the merely physical. As we climbed the winding path, the oppressive silence became absolute. No birds called from the twisted trees that lined the road. No insects buzzed in the tall grass. Even the horses' hooves seemed muted, as though the very air had grown thick enough to swallow sound before it could travel more than a few feet. The abbey itself was a masterwork of Gothic architecture that had been corrupted by something that had nothing to do with time or weather. Gargoyles that should have been decorative seemed to track our movement with eyes that held malicious intelligence, and I could swear I saw one of them shift position when I wasn't looking directly at it. Flying buttresses stretched like the ribs of some massive beast, and the rose window above the main entrance had been boarded over from the inside with planks that wept a substance too dark to be water and too thick to be blood. We stopped at the village tavern at the base of the hill, where I intended to gather information and allow the horses a brief rest. The innkeeper, a grizzled man whose left eye had turned completely white, and whose right eye seemed to see far too much, grabbed my sleeve the moment I stepped inside. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone who looked as though he hadn't eaten in weeks, and his fingers were so cold they felt like ice through my cassock. "Father, I beg you, turn back while you still have a soul to save," he whispered, his breath misting in air that had suddenly grown frigid. "The abbey's bells have been ringing without pause for 3 days and 3 nights, but they don't toll for the dead. They toll for the living, and with each chime another soul goes missing from our village. Not dead, Father. Missing, as though they never existed at all." He led me to a window that faced the hill, pointing with a hand that shook so violently he could barely maintain direction. 12 of our people have climbed that path since the ringing began. They went up whole and human, carrying their memories and their names and their loves. They came down empty, wearing their own faces, but speaking in voices that belonged to things that died before Christ walked the earth. Other patrons in the tavern nodded grimly, their faces bearing the hollow look of people who had seen too much and understood too little. A woman with flour-dusted hands and tears that fell upward spoke up. "My Henri went up there 2 days ago. He came back knowing things about our family that died, with our grandparents, speaking the names of stillborn children we never told anyone about. We had to lock him in the root cellar, Father. The sounds he makes down there, they're not human sounds, but they're not inhuman either. They're the sounds of humanity being slowly digested by something that finds us amusing." An old man in the corner, his face scarred by burns that formed patterns too regular to be accidental, added, "The ones who come back, they're not trying to hurt us, Father. That's what makes it so much worse. They're trying to warn us, but the warnings come in languages that make your ears bleed to hear them, and the more you understand, the more you wish you didn't." I thanked them for their counsel and pressed a gold coin blessed by Pope Pius V into the innkeeper's trembling palm. The coin immediately began to smoke against his skin, but his relief was palpable when I assured him I would spend the night at the Abbey rather than in his establishment. As the carriage resumed its ascent, the Abbey's bells rang with increasing urgency, their bronze voices carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the bones. The sound was impossibly layered, suggesting multiple bells ringing in perfect synchronization despite the fact that I could see only one bell tower. But more disturbing than the sound itself was the rhythm, a pattern that matched no earthly heartbeat but felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl with recognition. The Abbey's iron gates stood open, their hinges screaming like souls in torment as the wind pushed them back and forth. No guard stood watch, no porter emerged to greet us. The courtyard beyond was paved with stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of pilgrim feet, but now those stones bore stains that formed a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence, and too complex to be the work of human hands. Prior Matien emerged from the shadows of the main entrance like a spectre summoned by our arrival. Once he might have been an imposing figure, a man whose presence commanded respect, and whose voice carried the authority of divine appointment. But whatever had transpired at Vilhelm Abbey had reduced him to a skeletal framework draped in priestly robes that hung like burial shrouds. His hands shook so violently that the rosary he clutched rattled like chains, and his eyes darted constantly, never focusing on one point for more than a heartbeat, as though he were watching for something that could approach from any direction at any time. "Father Elbrecht," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible over the constant tolling of the bells. "Thank God and all his saints that you've come, though I fear even your unique methods may prove insufficient against what we face here." He approached the carriage but stopped just outside arm's reach, as though some invisible barrier prevented him from coming closer. When I stepped down onto the courtyard stones, I felt them shift slightly beneath my weight, as though they were floating on something liquid, rather than resting on solid earth. "Half our brothers have vanished, Father," Matien continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality that suggested he had repeated these words many times, possibly to convince himself they were true. Not fled in terror, not abandoned their vows in despair, but simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Their cells are empty, their belongings untouched, but their voices still echo through the halls at night, singing hymns in harmonies that were never meant for human throats. The driver began unloading my equipment without being asked, handling the sealed cases with the practiced care of someone who understood that their contents could end worlds if mishandled. Prior Mathien's eyes widened as he recognized some of the containers, particularly the lead-lined box that required 2 men to lift and hummed with barely contained energy, and the silver case that seemed to bend light around itself in ways that made it difficult to look at directly. "The remaining brothers?" I inquired as we walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing strangely in the vast courtyard. "Where are they now? Those who haven't lost their minds entirely are in the chapel praying without pause," Matien replied, his voice growing stronger as we moved away from the carriage. "They believe that if they stop, even for a moment to drink water, or close their eyes in sleep, they'll be taken like the others. They've been sustaining themselves on communion wafers and blessed wine for 3 days now, and some of them have begun to speak in tongues. But not holy tongues, Father. These are languages that predate the Tower of Babel, words that seem to change reality simply by being spoken aloud." He paused before massive oak doors bound with iron that bore scorch marks from the inside, as though something intensely hot had pressed against the metal from within the abbey itself. The door handles were wrapped in chains, and those chains were wrapped in blessed cloth that had been soaked in holy water so frequently it had taken on a translucent quality. "But there is one who remains in a different state entirely," Matien said, producing a key that was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate slightly in his palm. Brother Severin, he resisted longer than the rest, held on to his humanity through sheer force of will and an understanding of ancient texts that even I don't fully comprehend. But now, the key required both his trembling hands to turn in the ancient lock, and when the massive door finally opened, the sound it made was like a great beast taking its first breath after years of suffocation. Beyond lay a narrow staircase carved directly into the living rock beneath the abbey, descending into darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. The air that rose from below was not merely cold, but possessed of a quality that seemed to leach warmth from anything it touched. I could hear something moving in the depths. Not footsteps, but a rhythmic scraping sound like fingernails dragging across stone in patterns that suggested they were writing messages in a script that had never been designed for human comprehension. As we descended, our footsteps echoing in ways that suggested the staircase was far longer than it appeared, Matthian continued his explanation in whispers that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. Brother Severin was our scholar, our keeper of texts that the Vatican officially denies exist. When the occurrence began 3 nights ago, he was the first to recognize its true nature. He barricaded himself in the scriptorium with manuscripts that predate Christianity by millennia, trying to find some ritual or prayer or binding that might contain what had been unleashed. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, our breath beginning to mist despite the spring warmth that should have penetrated even into the abbey's depths. The walls were covered in moisture that wasn't quite water, pooling in channels that had been carved into the stone with tools that left marks unlike anything made by human hands. Strange symbols covered the rock, not carved, but burned in, as though something with incredible heat had pressed against the stone and left impressions of thoughts rather than images. We found him 3 days later, Matthian continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a confession, suspended in the center of his chamber, held aloft by forces that left no visible means of support. But he was still himself then, still fighting, still human enough to recognize our faces and speak our names. He told us things, Father, warned us about what was coming, what had always been coming, what we had somehow kept at bay for 8 centuries, through ignorance more than faith. The staircase ended at a chamber carved from bedrock that had never seen sunlight, its walls weeping moisture that collected in channels, cut into the floor in patterns that hurt to observe for more than a few seconds at a time. The air itself seemed thick, as though it were trying to become something more substantial than mere atmosphere. Brother Severin hung suspended in the center of the space, held by iron chains forged in Vatican foundries according to designs that officially didn't exist. His body was contorted into positions that defied human anatomy, joints bent at angles that should have been impossible without breaking every bone in his frame. But somehow he remained intact, his flesh flowing like water to accommodate positions that would have killed any ordinary man. But it was his eyes that revealed the true horror of his condition. Once brown according to his personnel records, they now held the depths that seemed to reflect not light but something far more disturbing. Knowledge that no human mind was designed to contain. Visions of realities that existed in spaces between seconds. Understanding of truths that could drive entire civilizations to madness simply by being comprehended. The moment I entered the chamber, his head snapped toward me with the sound of vertebrae popping like gunshots echoing in a cathedral. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had been replaced by something that gleamed like polished obsidian and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Corvin Elbrecht, he said in a voice that contained harmonics no human throat could produce, making the stone walls resonate like the inside of a massive bell. Born in Bavaria on October 13th, 1868. Ordained at 23 after showing unusual resistance to spiritual influence currently carrying 17 separate infernal entities within your consecrated soul. Welcome to Vilhelm Abbey, old friend. We've been expecting you for so very long. The temperature in the chamber plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the walls, in patterns that resembled writing in scripts that predated human language. My breath came out in clouds so thick they obscured my vision, and I could feel moisture freezing in my beard, creating a mask of ice that cracked when I spoke. The chains that bound Severin bore deep scratches on their inner surfaces, as though something had tried to claw its way out through solid iron, but the scratches formed patterns, deliberate markings that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles, creating the impression of messages written in 3 dimensions by something that understood geometry in ways that human minds couldn't process. "You know why I'm here," I said, setting down my equipment case and beginning to remove its contents with hands that had grown steady through decades of practice with the impossible. Brother Severin laughed, and the sound contained multitudes, voices layered upon voices in harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Each laugh was a different entity, a different personality, a different fragment of something that had once been whole, but had been shattered across dimensions by forces that couldn't be contained in any single reality. "Oh, Corvin, you still think in terms of conventional exorcism," he said, his voice shifting through octaves that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. "Holy water that has been blessed by 12 different popes, sacred salt harvested from the Dead Sea and purified through rituals that take 6 months to complete, a crucifix carved from wood taken from the true cross itself. You might as well try to stop a hurricane with an umbrella or hold back the ocean with your bare hands." He was right, of course. I'd dealt with enough possessions to recognize when standard methods would prove not just inadequate, but actively dangerous. This case had moved far beyond the realm of traditional demonic possession into something that required the Vatican's most closely guarded secrets, knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of encounters with things that officially didn't exist. The entity, wearing Severin's face, began reciting then, speaking sins from my past in voices I recognized all too well. Not just my own transgressions, the small cruelties and failures of faith that every priest carried, but the sins of every demon I had previously contained within my soul. He spoke as Father Guillermo, the first entity I had absorbed in Barcelona in 1995, describing murders committed with a bone knife in a voice like grinding glass. He became Sister Agnes, who had possessed an entire convent in Prague, whispering seductions in languages that predated the Tower of Babel, and promising pleasures that would damn entire bloodlines. One by one, he channeled 17 different hells that I carried within myself, each voice a reminder of what I had become in service to the Church and humanity. "You feel them stirring, don't you?" Severin asked, his form beginning to shift and blur as multiple personalities fought for control of his features. 17 different demons, all contained within your blessed soul, through rituals that would make the Spanish Inquisition weep with terror and admiration. And now they sense a kindred spirit, something far older and infinitely more powerful than any of them, something that remembers the time before time, when the universe was young and malleable and could be shaped by will alone. The chains binding him began to rattle as invisible forces struck them from within, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the chamber, I could hear the sound of many voices whispering in languages that had been spoken before human vocal cords evolved to their current form. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, and I began to recognize some of the words, not because I understood the languages, but because the 17 demons within my soul were responding to them, adding their own voices to a chorus that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. Prior Matien led me from the chamber through passages that seemed to stretch longer with each step we took, past doorways that opened onto rooms filled with shadows, too thick to be natural and too deliberate to be random. We climbed a spiral staircase that wound through the heart of the abbey like a massive screw boring through reality itself, emerging finally in the highest tower where the abbey's most precious and dangerous manuscripts were kept. The tower room was circular, its walls lined with cases that required 3 different keys to open, each lock blessed by a different pope and inscribed with protections that had been refined over centuries of trial and error, each failure measured in lives lost and souls damned. The manuscripts within were older than Christianity itself, some written on parchment made from the skin of animals that had been extinct for millennia, others inscribed on metal that had never been found in any earthly mine, and seemed to exist in a state of constant flux between solid and liquid. "The truth about your missions, Father," Matthian said as he opened a particular tome, bound in leather, that felt disturbingly warm and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. "The Vatican doesn't send you to banish evil because banishment implies the possibility of return, and some things are too dangerous to risk letting loose in any realm, earthly or otherwise." The book he opened contained text written in script that seemed to move when observed directly, rearranging itself into different languages as my eyes moved across the page. But I had seen such books before, in the deepest archives of the Vatican, and I had learned to read them through peripheral vision and sheer force of will, allowing their meaning to seep into my consciousness like poison into an open wound. "You are a living prison, Corvin," Matthian continued, his voice heavy with something that might have been pity or might have been awe. "Every demon you've faced, every horror you've conquered, they live inside you now, contained by rituals that bind them to your consecrated soul. You are holy enough to hold them and damned enough to survive their presence, blessed enough to contain them and cursed enough to endure what that containment costs." I looked at my reflection in the tower's ancient mirror and saw not one man but the suggestion of dozens of figures, writhing beneath my skin like fish beneath ice. Some I recognized from past cases. The Marquis who had possessed the children's hospital in Venice, the thing that had called itself Mary and spoken through the mouths of statues in Notre Dame, the entity that had turned the seminary in Dublin into a gateway to dimensions where mathematics followed different rules. Others were too distorted by their spiritual imprisonment to maintain coherent form, existing as impressions of malevolence and hunger that had been compressed into the sacred space of my soul. "The entity possessing Brother Severin is not merely another demon," Matthian said, turning pages in the accursed book, until he reached an illustration that made my vision blur and my stomach lurch with vertigo. "It is a fragment of something that existed before the concept of existence itself was defined, before the first words were spoken to separate light from darkness, before the fundamental laws of reality were established as immutable truths." The illustration showed a form that could not be adequately described in human terms, something that existed in dimensions that human perception couldn't process without suffering permanent damage. Looking at it was like trying to see around a corner that existed in a direction that had no name, like attempting to comprehend a colour that had never been part of any spectrum that eyes were designed to perceive. "If it escapes," Matthian whispered, his voice dropping to barely audible levels, as though speaking the words too loudly might make them true, "it won't simply possess individual souls, or corrupt human flesh, or twist reality in small, localized ways. It will remake the fundamental nature of existence itself, turning the physical world into a reflection of the primordial chaos that existed before creation, before order was imposed upon the void." I understood then why the Vatican had sent me specifically, why this case had been deemed too dangerous for conventional exorcism, or even for the specialized teams that dealt with Category 5 possessions. This was beyond the power of bishops or cardinals or even the Pope himself. This required the use of tools and knowledge that the Church officially denied possessing, methods that had been developed in the centuries before Christianity learned to present a civilized face to the world. "There is no banishment ritual powerful enough to contain something this ancient," I said, closing the blasphemous book and feeling my soul recoil from even that brief contact with knowledge that human minds weren't designed to hold. "And if we attempt a standard exorcism, it will simply transfer to the next available vessel, probably killing the host in the process and emerging stronger than before." "Yes," Martin agreed, his face grey with exhaustion and a terror so profound it had become a permanent feature of his expression. "Which is why you're here, isn't it? Not to destroy the entity. That may not even be possible, but to add it to your collection, to make yourself the prison for something that has never been successfully contained by any human soul, no matter how blessed or prepared." I felt the 17 demons already within me, stirring at the prospect, some excited by the possibility of communion with something so ancient and powerful, others terrified of being consumed or overshadowed by it. The constant murmur of their voices, which I had learned to ignore over the years like the sound of one's own breathing, grew louder and more insistent, a chorus of infernal commentary on what I was contemplating. The abbey's crypt lay 3 levels below the foundations, accessible only through passages that had been carved by monks who understood the necessity of keeping certain things as far from the light of day as possible. The chamber I needed was the oldest part of the structure, predating the abbey itself by several centuries. It had been built by druids who understood the importance of containing rather than banishing certain forms of spiritual presence, who knew that some things were too dangerous to send away but too necessary to destroy. The room was circular, carved from bedrock that had never been touched by sunlight, its walls bearing symbols that had been old when Rome was young, and Babylon was merely a dream in the minds of nomadic tribes. In the centre was a circle inscribed with marks that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles, surrounding a raised platform where the most dangerous rituals could be safely performed. If safety was even a meaningful concept when dealing with forces that predated the establishment of natural law. I began my preparation with tools that had never been blessed by any Christian authority, but which had been consecrated through rituals far older than the church itself. The silver blade I used to carve additional marks into the stone floor had been forged from metal, taken from a meteorite that had fallen during the reign of Emperor Nero, tempered in fires that burned substances that didn't exist in nature, and cooled in waters that flowed through dimensions where different physical laws applied. The incense I burned filled the air with smoke that caused visions of landscapes where geometry followed rules that would drive mathematicians to madness, where time moved in spirals rather than straight lines, where the horizon curved upward instead of away, and the sky existed beneath one's feet rather than overhead. The smoke itself seemed to have weight and intelligence, coiling around the ritual circle in patterns that suggested it was reading the symbols carved into the stone and finding them satisfactory. As the ritual progressed, the abbey itself began to respond to what I was invoking. The constant tolling of the bells above grew more urgent, their rhythm changing to match patterns that had been used in ceremonies that predated human civilization. Stone walls began to weep, a substance that wasn't quite blood, but burned like acid when it touched skin, pooling on the floor in configurations that resembled script written in a language of pain and suffering. Statues throughout the building turned their heads to look toward the crypt, their carved eyes focusing on something they could see but I could not yet perceive. In the chapel above, the remaining monks fell silent for the first time in 3 days, their prayers cut off mid-syllable, as though something had reached down their throats and stolen their voices. Brother Severin's body began to rise from his chains in the chamber below, hovering in the air as the entity inside him grew stronger and more confident. His limbs stretched and contorted, bones breaking and reforming, with sounds like snapping branches, flesh flowing like water to accommodate joints that bent in directions human anatomy was never designed to allow. But the changes went beyond the merely physical. Reality itself began to bend around his floating form, creating distortions that made it difficult to determine where his body ended and the air around him began. "You know why you're really here, Corvin?" the thing wearing Severin's face called down to me, its voice carrying clearly through solid stone, as though the barriers between us were merely suggestions that could be ignored by sufficient will. "Not to destroy me, that would be beyond your power even if it were possible. Certainly not to banish me to some other realm, where I might eventually find another way, back to this dimension, as you've done with lesser entities. You're here to invite me in, to make yourself my home just as you've done for 17 lesser beings." The ritual reached its crescendo as the fundamental laws of reality began to buckle under the strain of what I was attempting to invoke and contain simultaneously. Stone walls developed cracks that revealed not empty space but glimpses of dimensions where light moved like liquid and sound had colour and weight. The temperature fluctuated wildly, jumping from freezing to scalding and back again as the chamber tried to accommodate forces that had no place in the physical world as it was currently constituted. The Abbey's bells, which had rung without pause for 3 days, suddenly crashed down through the floors above, each massive bronze instrument falling through stone as though it were water. The impact sent shockwaves through the building that could be felt for miles, shattering windows in villages throughout the Loire Valley and causing every church bell within 50 miles to ring in sympathy, creating a symphony of bronze voices that announced to the world that something fundamental was about to change. Prior Matien had followed me down to witness the conclusion of the ritual, but the sight of what was taking place drove him to his knees, in a posture that was part prayer and part surrender. Blood streamed from his eyes as his mind tried to process things that human perception was never meant to accommodate, and he began praying in Latin that gradually shifted into languages that had been extinct for millennia, pulled from his memory by forces that had access to knowledge he had never consciously possessed. The entity tore itself free from Brother Severin's body, which crumbled to dust the moment it was no longer needed as a vessel. In its true form, it appeared as a mass of living shadow that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, reaching into spaces that were perpendicular to everything else, in ways that made the eye water and the mind recoil. The very air around it rippled like water disturbed by something moving just beneath the surface, and reality bent around its presence like light around a massive gravitational field. But what was most disturbing about its appearance was not its alien geometry or its impossible existence, but the sense of recognition it inspired. Looking at it, I felt the same sensation I experienced when looking at my own reflection, the uncomfortable awareness that I was seeing something that was both familiar and utterly foreign, something that belonged to me and yet had never been mine. I stood in the collapsing crypt with the fundamental nature of existence, fracturing around me like glass, facing the choice I had made 17 times before, but never with stakes this cosmic in scope. The entity circled me like a predator examining its prey, its form shifting through configurations that included geometries that had no names and angles, that violated every law of mathematics that human civilization had ever discovered. "Look at yourself, Corvin," it whispered in a voice that bypassed my ears entirely and spoke directly to the demons already imprisoned within my soul. "Each time you've done this, each time you've opened yourself to contain another fragment of hell, you've become less human and more like us. Your flesh is still warm, your heart still beats, but the soul that animates that flesh has been carved away piece by piece and replaced with darkness that wears the mask of light." I could feel the truth of its words in the way my reflection no longer quite matched my movements, in the way shadows fell differently around me than around other people, in the way holy water sometimes steamed when it touched my skin, despite my consecrated state. I was no longer truly a priest, no longer fully human, but something caught between worlds, a bridge between heaven and hell that served the purposes of neither. Soon there will be no difference between us, the entity continued, its form growing larger and more imposing as it sensed my wavering resolve. You carry enough demons to populate a small hell already. What's one more, even one as powerful and ancient as me? You've become so practiced at spiritual imprisonment that you barely notice the weight anymore. But this time will be different, Corvin. This time you won't be the prison. You'll be the prisoner. But I did notice the weight. Every morning when I woke, I felt the presence of 17 different hells stirring within my blessed soul. I heard their whispers during Mass, felt their hunger when I blessed the communion wine, sensed their amusement when I offered comfort to the grieving. They had not been banished or destroyed. They had simply been relocated from wherever they came from to the consecrated prison of my spirit, and that relocation had cost me pieces of my humanity that I could never reclaim. The ritual I began then was not one that appeared in any Vatican manual or church doctrine. It was older than Christianity, older than any organized religion, a summoning and binding that had been refined through centuries of desperate experimentation by people who understood that some things were too dangerous to destroy and too powerful to ignore. I knelt in the center of the inscribed circle and spoke words in a language that had existed before human vocal cords evolved to their current configuration. The syllables felt wrong in my mouth, their pronunciation requiring sounds that human anatomy was never designed to produce. But I'd learned this language through 17 previous possessions, taught by demons who remembered the time before time, when such words were spoken by beings that predated humanity by eons. The entity rushed toward me like a tide of living darkness, and the impact drove me to my knees as pain beyond any physical description tore through every fibre of my being. My vision went white, then black, then filled with colours that had no names, as the thing that had called itself ancient when the stars were young forced its way into the spiritual prison of my consecrated soul. But this time was different. As the entity entered my soul, I felt something I had never experienced in 17 previous absorptions. Instead of simply adding itself to the collection of demons I already carried, it began to consume them, devouring their essence and incorporating their power into itself. I felt Father Guillermo scream as he was torn apart and absorbed. Sister Agnes dissolved into component fragments of malevolence that were digested like spiritual nutrients. One by one, the 17 demons that had been my burden for decades were consumed by something so much older and more powerful that they provided no more resistance than candle flames in a hurricane. And then, when it had finished feeding on my collected demons, the entity turned its attention to me. "Did you really think," it said from within my own mind, its voice now coming from my own thoughts, "that you could contain something like me the same way you contained those pathetic lesser spirits? I am not a demon, Corvin. I am not a fallen angel or a corrupted soul, or any other thing that your religion has named and categorized. I am what existed before existence, what thought before consciousness, what hungered before the first mouth was made to feed." I felt my sense of self beginning to dissolve as the entity explored the architecture of my soul, like a new homeowner examining their property. My memories became its memories, my knowledge became its knowledge, my consecrated status became its spiritual armor against any force that might try to banish or bind it. "For centuries, your Vatican has used you as a living prison," the entity continued, its voice now indistinguishable from my own internal monologue. "But I will use you as a doorway. Through your blessed flesh, I can walk in the world without triggering the cosmic defenses that have kept me contained for millennia. Through your sacred authority, I can reshape reality one small change at a time, making alterations so subtle that no one will notice until it's far too late to stop what I've become. I tried to fight back to assert some control over my own soul, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands. The entity had not simply taken residence in my spirit. It had rewritten the fundamental nature of who and what I was. I could feel my memories being edited, my personality being adjusted, my very identity being slowly consumed and replaced by something that wore my face like a mask. But I am not cruel, Corvin, it whispered with my own voice. I will let you watch. In the deepest corner of what was once your soul, I will preserve just enough of you to observe what I accomplish with your body, your authority, your blessed flesh. You will see the world remade according to my vision, and you will understand that what you called reality was nothing more than a pleasant dream that I am finally waking from. Prior Martin watched in horror as I stood, but what rose from the ritual circle was no longer Father Corvin Elbrecht. My movements now possessed a fluid grace that suggested my bones had been replaced with something more adaptable, and when I smiled, it was with knowledge of appetites that no human mouth had ever been designed to express. The Abbey's collapse stopped abruptly, not because the building had been saved, but because the source of the reality distortion had achieved its goal. The entity no longer needed to rip its way into the world. It had found a perfect vessel through which to enter quietly, without triggering the cosmic alarms that had kept it imprisoned for so long. Tell the Vatican that Father Elbrecht's mission was successful, I said to Prior Martin, my voice carrying harmonics that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Tell them that the entity has been contained, that Vilhelm Abbey is safe, that the threat has been neutralized. They will want to believe you because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. Martin nodded frantically, blood still streaming from his eyes as his mind tried to process what he had witnessed. What? What will you do now? What I have always done, I replied, walking through the ruins of the crypt with footsteps that left frost patterns in the stone, despite the spring warmth. I will serve the church faithfully, as I have for 30 years. I will take confession and offer comfort to the grieving. I will bless marriages and perform last rites. I will be the perfect priest, beyond reproach or suspicion. I paused at the crypt entrance and looked back at the chamber where reality had been permanently altered. But slowly, oh so slowly, I will begin to make small changes. A blessing here that means something different than it appears. A prayer there that opens doors better left closed. Holy water that has been consecrated to purposes that your church would weep to understand. And with each small change, each tiny alteration to the spiritual fabric of the world, I will bring about a transformation so gradual that humanity will never realize what's happening until it's already complete. As I emerged from Vilhelm Abbey, dawn was breaking across the Loire Valley, painting the sky in shades that seemed more vivid and terrible than they had ever appeared before. But now I could see colours that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human vision, perceive dimensions that folded through spaces that had no names, understand the true structure of reality, and how easily it could be reshaped by someone with sufficient knowledge and patience. The carriage that had brought me to Wilhelm waited at the Abbey gates, its driver as silent and ageless as ever, but I chose not to ride, instead walking alone down the cobblestone path that led back towards the world of ordinary, human concerns. With each step, I could feel the entity settling more completely into its new home, learning to use my memories and mannerisms to create a perfect impersonation of the man I had once been. Villagers who witnessed my departure saw only Father Elbrecht, returning from another successful mission. They crossed themselves and whispered prayers of gratitude that the holy man had once again saved them from forces they couldn't understand. Children would sleep peacefully in their beds, secure in the knowledge that the church's most dedicated servant had triumphed over evil once more. But in the deepest corner of what had once been my soul, the real Corvin Elbrecht screamed silently as he watched his body walk away from Vilhelm Abbey, carrying within itself something that had existed since before the first star ignited in the cosmic darkness. I was still there, still aware, still conscious of what was happening, but powerless to stop it or even influence it in any meaningful way. The entity wearing my face made its way back to Rome over the following weeks, stopping at churches and shrines along the way to perform what appeared to be routine blessings and benedictions. But each ritual it conducted was subtly altered, each prayer modified in ways that no human observer could detect. Ancient words were pronounced with different emphases that changed their meanings. Sacred gestures were performed with minute variations that opened pathways to dimensions that should have remained sealed. When I finally returned to the Vatican, Cardinal Torretti himself greeted me with relief and gratitude. "Father Elbrecht, thank God you're safe. We heard about the situation at Vilhelm Abbey. Another successful containment, I trust." "The threat has been neutralized, Your Eminence," the entity replied with my voice, my mannerisms, my practiced humility. "The possessed monk has been cleansed, the abbey has been consecrated, and the spiritual contamination has been removed. I recommend that the site be blessed once more in 6 months' time as a precautionary measure." The Cardinal nodded, making notes in a file that would be sealed in the Vatican's most secure archives. "Excellent work as always. Your methods remain unorthodox, but your results speak for themselves. Take some time to rest, Father. You look tired." And I was tired in ways that went far beyond the physical. Trapped in the prison of my own mind, I watched as the entity began its slow, methodical work of corrupting the church from within. It performed my duties flawlessly, celebrating Mass with appropriate solemnity, hearing confessions with perfect compassion, offering counsel to the troubled with wisdom that seemed genuinely divine. But I could see the changes it was making, subtle alterations to rituals that had remained unchanged for centuries. A word here, a gesture there, modifications so small that even the most observant scholar would dismiss them as minor variations in personal style. Yet each change was calculated to weaken the spiritual defenses that had protected humanity for millennia, creating cracks in the cosmic armor that kept certain things from entering the world. Years passed, and the entity's work progressed with inhuman patience. Other priests began unconsciously adopting the modifications they observed in my behavior, spreading the corruption through the church hierarchy like a spiritual virus. Seminary students learned subtly altered versions of ancient prayers, carrying the contamination to every corner of the Catholic world. I watched helplessly as the entity used my reputation and authority to gain access to the Vatican's most sacred relics and texts. It blessed holy water with intentions that would have horrified any true priest, consecrated communion wafers with purposes that transformed the Eucharist into something that opened channels to realms of existence that had been sealed since the foundation of the world. The changes were so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that no one suspected anything was wrong. The church continued to function as it always had. Its priests continued to serve their congregations with apparent dedication, and the faithful continued to find comfort in traditions that seemed unchanged from their childhood memories. But I could see the truth. Reality itself was being slowly rewritten, one prayer at a time, one blessing at a time, one small change at a time. The entity had learned from millennia of observation that dramatic transformations triggered resistance, that sudden changes alerted cosmic defenses that could stop even something as powerful as itself. Instead, it worked with the patience of geological time, reshaping the world so gradually that each generation would accept the new normal without question. And somewhere in the deepest archives of the Vatican, in files that were sealed with wax that bore the mark of popes, whose names had been erased from history, new reports began to appear. Stories of strange occurrences in parishes around the world, of miracles that didn't quite follow the expected patterns, of saint statues that wept tears of colours that had no names, of holy sites where reality seemed slightly different than it should be. But these reports were filed away and forgotten, dismissed as the fantasies of overworked priests or the hallucinations of the overly devout. After all, Father Corvin Elbrecht continued to handle the Church's most difficult cases with his usual efficiency, and his track record of successful containment spoke for itself. The Vatican never suspected that their final solution had become their ultimate downfall, that the man they sent when there was no hope left had become the vessel for something that would slowly, patiently, inevitably transform their world into something unrecognizable. In the darkness of my mental prison, I screamed warnings that no one could hear, wept tears that no one could see, and watched as the entity wearing my face smiled at congregations who believed they were receiving the blessing of a holy man. Because evil had learned the most important lesson of all, that the most effective way to destroy something is not to attack it directly, but to corrupt it from within, using its own strength and traditions against it until salvation becomes damnation, and light becomes a different kind of darkness entirely. The Vatican had sent me when there was no hope left, believing that no soul was safe from the evil they faced. They had been right about that, but wrong about everything else. No soul was safe, especially not mine. And now, wearing my flesh and speaking with my voice, something that had existed since before existence began its patient work of unmaking everything that humanity held sacred, one blessed prayer at a time. The end was not coming, with fire and brimstone, with trumpets and apocalyptic revelation. It was coming with Sunday Mass and evening prayers, with baptisms and last rites, with all the gentle rituals that believers had trusted for 2,000 years. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, it would already be far too late to stop what I had become.